The morning frost clung to the windshield of the old Ford pickup as 28-year-old Michael Thompson sat in the cab, staring at the farmhouse where he'd grown up. The engine ticked as it cooled, the only sound breaking the silence of dawn in rural Iowa. 3 months had passed since his father's funeral, and the weight of inheritance sat heavy on his shoulders like the morning mist that rolled across the cornfields. Have you ever inherited something that seemed like a burden rather than a blessing? Michael was about to discover that sometimes the most valuable gifts come disguised as disappointments. The red barn stood weathered but sturdy, housing the sum total of his father's agricultural empire, a 1965 John Deere 4020 with faded green paint and a 1970 Ford 8000 that had seen better decades. No gleaming new equipment, no state-of-the-art technology, just 2 machines that his father, Robert Thompson, had maintained with the devotion of a craftsman and the frugality of a Depression-era survivor. Michael climbed out of the truck, his boots crunching on the gravel driveway. The familiar smell of diesel fuel and old leather filled his nostrils as he pushed open the barn doors. Sunlight streamed through the gaps in the wooden slats, illuminating dust motes that danced around the 2 tractors like memories refusing to settle. His cousin Danny had stopped by the week before, fresh from signing papers on a brand new Case IH Magnum 7250. "Mike, you can't run a modern farm with museum pieces," Danny had said, running his hand along the John Deere's worn seat. "Dad left me enough to upgrade everything. You should consider financing something decent before spring planting." The comparison stung because it seemed so obvious. Danny's father, Robert's brother, had left behind a portfolio of investments and a clear path to modernization. Michael's inheritance felt like a step backward into an era when farming was more about survival than profit. But Robert Thompson had been a man of few words and fewer explanations. He'd never talked about retirement plans or investment strategies. He'd simply worked the land, maintained his equipment, and paid his bills on time. To Michael, it had seemed like a life of missed opportunities and stubborn traditionalism. The John Deere 4020 sat silent, its diesel engine cold but ready. Michael had learned to operate this machine when his legs barely reached the pedals, standing on the platform while his father guided his small hands on the steering wheel. The tractor had pulled plows through spring mud, powered hay balers through summer heat, and hauled grain wagons through autumn harvests for nearly 2 decades. Michael walked around the machine, noting the careful maintenance his father had performed. Every grease fitting had been serviced, every fluid level checked, every worn part replaced with genuine John Deere components. The paint might have faded, but the engine ran smooth as silk, and the hydraulics responded with the precision of a Swiss watch. The Ford 8000 told a similar story. Purchased used in 1975, it had become Robert's primary field tractor for heavy work. The cab showed wear from countless hours of operation, but the transmission shifted smoothly, and the engine started on the first turn of the key. These weren't museum pieces, Michael realized. They were tools, carefully maintained and completely paid for. As he stood in the barn that morning, Michael made a decision that would define his farming career. He would honor his father's approach, at least for the first season. No financing, no debt, just the equipment at hand and the knowledge passed down through generations of Thompson farmers. The decision felt both noble and foolish. Noble because it respected his father's memory, foolish because it seemed to guarantee failure in an industry increasingly dominated by technology and scale. But something in the way his father had maintained these machines suggested a deeper wisdom that Michael was only beginning to understand. Spring planting arrived with the urgency it always brought to Iowa farmers. While Danny roared across his fields with his new Case IH, covering ground at speeds that would have been impossible with older equipment, Michael methodically worked his acres with the John Deere 4020. The pace was slower, but the work was steady and deliberate. Neighbors stopped by with a mixture of curiosity and concern. "Mike, you're working twice as hard to cover half the ground," observed Jim Patterson, whose own farm had been modernized with a substantial equipment loan. "That old Deere's a classic, but it's not going to pay the bills." The comments weren't meant to be cruel, but they reinforced Michael's growing sense of isolation. In coffee shops and farm supply stores, conversations centered around horsepower ratings, GPS guidance systems, and precision agriculture technologies that his equipment couldn't support. He felt like a blacksmith in the age of automobiles, clinging to methods that the world had left behind. But the John Deere kept running. Day after day, it pulled the four-bottom plow through the rich Iowa soil, turning under last year's corn stubble with the same reliability it had shown for 17 years. The Ford 8000 handled the heavy disking and field cultivation, its powerful engine never straining under loads that would challenge smaller machines. Michael began to appreciate the simplicity of his equipment. When something broke, he could diagnose and repair it himself. No computer diagnostics, no dealer-only software, no proprietary parts that cost more than his monthly grocery budget. The tractors were mechanical puzzles that yielded their secrets to anyone willing to learn their language of gears, hydraulics, and diesel combustion. His father had taught him this language without formal lessons. Robert Thompson had been a man who believed in showing rather than telling, in demonstration rather than explanation. Every Saturday morning had been spent in the shop, watching his father's weathered hands work magic on mechanical problems that seemed insurmountable to a young boy's eyes. "Son," his father had said during one of those Saturday sessions, "a machine that's paid for will work just as hard as one that owns you." At the time, Michael had thought it was just another of his father's cryptic observations about the value of thrift. Now, as he watched Danny struggle with equipment payments that consumed a significant portion of his farm's cash flow, the wisdom became clear. The first test of Michael's resolve came in late May when the John Deere's clutch began slipping during heavy pulling. Danny suggested it was time to trade up, but Michael remembered his father's approach to mechanical problems. Instead of panicking or reaching for a loan application, he ordered the necessary parts and spent a weekend rebuilding the clutch assembly in the barn. The work was dirty and demanding, requiring the removal of the transmission and careful attention to dozens of small components. But when Michael fired up the tractor on Sunday evening, the clutch engaged with the firm authority of a new machine. The repair had cost less than $200 and provided a satisfaction that no dealer service could match. Word of Michael's mechanical skills began to spread through the farming community. Neighbors who had known his father started bringing their own equipment problems to the Thompson barn, remembering Robert's reputation as a man who could fix anything with wheels or an engine. Michael found himself earning extra income by applying the skills his father had taught him, skills that seemed increasingly rare in an age of disposable technology. But the real revelation was still coming, hidden in a manila envelope that would arrive with the autumn tax notices. October brought the harvest season and the annual ritual of property tax assessments. Michael had been dreading this moment, knowing that property taxes on farmland had been rising steadily as development pressure increased throughout Iowa. The envelope from the county assessor's office sat on his kitchen table for 2 days before he found the courage to open it. The first page contained the expected information, acreage assessments, building valuations, and the calculated tax burden for the coming year. But the second page contained a line item that made Michael's heart skip: mineral rights assessment, $47,000. Michael stared at the number, certain it was a mistake. His father had never mentioned mineral rights, never spoken of any value beneath the soil beyond its agricultural potential. The farm had been in the Thompson family for 3 generations, but Michael had always assumed it was simply good farmland, nothing more. A phone call to the county assessor's office confirmed what the paperwork suggested. The Thompson farm sat above a geological formation that contained significant limestone deposits, and recent surveys had identified the property as having substantial mineral extraction potential. A quarry company had been quietly acquiring mineral rights throughout the area, and the Thompson farm represented one of the most valuable parcels in the county. The assessor explained that Robert Thompson had been receiving annual lease payments for the mineral rights for over 15 years, payments that had been deposited into a separate account that Michael knew nothing about. The account, now transferred to Michael's name, contained over $200,000 in accumulated lease payments and interest. Michael sat in his father's old office chair, surrounded by the familiar smell of pipe tobacco and machine oil, trying to process this revelation. His father had been wealthy, at least by farming standards, but had lived with the simplicity of a man who owned nothing more than basic necessities. The old equipment, the modest lifestyle, the careful maintenance of everything he owned, it all made sense now. Robert Thompson hadn't been unable to afford new equipment. He had chosen to avoid debt, to live within his means, and to build wealth quietly and systematically. The mineral rights income had provided financial security that no amount of borrowed money could match, but he had never allowed that security to change his fundamental approach to farming and life. The next morning, Michael called Danny to share the news. His cousin's reaction was a mixture of congratulation and bewilderment. "Uncle Robert never said a word about mineral rights," Danny said. "He always seemed like he was just getting by, you know. Why didn't he buy new equipment if he had that kind of money?" The question haunted Michael as he walked through the barn, looking at his father's tractors with new understanding. Robert Thompson had possessed the means to buy any equipment he wanted, but he had chosen to maintain what he had, to avoid the trap of debt, and to build wealth through patience rather than leverage. The wisdom of this approach became clear as the farm crisis of the 1980s deepened around them. Interest rates soared, land values plummeted, and farmers across Iowa found themselves trapped between falling commodity prices and rising debt payments. Danny's new equipment, purchased with borrowed money, became a millstone around his neck as cash flow tightened and banks began calling loans. Michael watched neighbors lose farms that had been in their families for generations, victims of an economic cycle that punished debt and rewarded liquidity. His father's conservative approach, which had seemed outdated and limiting, proved to be prophetic. The paid-for equipment continued to work, the mineral rights income provided a buffer against commodity price fluctuations, and the debt-free operation remained profitable even in the worst economic conditions. But the most valuable inheritance wasn't the money or the mineral rights. It was the philosophy that Robert Thompson had demonstrated through his actions, the understanding that true wealth comes from owning rather than owing, from building rather than borrowing, from patience rather than pressure. Michael began to see his father's silence in a new light. Robert Thompson hadn't been secretive about his wealth, he had been protective of his son's character. By allowing Michael to inherit equipment that seemed modest and a lifestyle that appeared simple, he had ensured that his son would learn the value of work, the satisfaction of self-reliance, and the wisdom of living within one's means. The John Deere 4020 and Ford 8000 weren't just tractors, they were teachers. Every hour spent maintaining them, every repair performed in the barn, every field worked with deliberate care had been part of an education in values that no amount of money could purchase. Robert Thompson had understood that a man who could fix his own equipment, manage his own finances, and resist the temptation of easy credit would be prepared for whatever challenges farming might present. As winter settled over the Iowa countryside, Michael made plans for the coming year. The mineral rights income would allow him to expand his operation, but he would do so carefully, following his father's example of growth through ownership rather than debt. He would buy used equipment that he could afford to pay for in cash, maintain it with the same care his father had shown, and build wealth slowly and systematically. The old tractors would remain the foundation of his operation, not because he couldn't afford better, but because they represented something more valuable than efficiency or prestige. They represented independence, self-reliance, and the kind of quiet strength that had built American agriculture one farm at a time. Danny eventually lost his farm to foreclosure, a victim of the debt cycle that had seemed so attractive when commodity prices were high and credit was easy. He came to work for Michael, operating the same museum pieces he had once criticized, learning to appreciate the reliability of equipment that started every morning and worked every day without the burden of monthly payments. The lesson of Robert Thompson's inheritance extended far beyond farming. In a world increasingly dominated by credit and consumption, he had demonstrated the power of patience, the wisdom of simplicity, and the strength that comes from owning rather than owing. His silence about his wealth hadn't been secrecy, it had been teaching, ensuring that his son would understand the difference between having money and being wealthy. Michael often thought about that morning in the barn when he had first questioned his inheritance. The disappointment he had felt seemed almost comical now, a young man's inability to recognize value that wasn't immediately obvious. His father had given him something far more precious than new equipment or easy money, he had given him the tools and wisdom to build a life of genuine prosperity. The county tax notice had exposed what his father never said, but it had also revealed what he had always known, that true wealth isn't measured by what you can afford to buy, but by what you can afford to own. Robert Thompson had owned his equipment, his land, and his independence. He had passed all three to his son, along with the wisdom to understand their value. As Michael prepared for another planting season, he looked at the John Deere 4020 with the respect it deserved. The tractor would turn 40 years old that spring, but it would plant corn with the same reliability it had shown since the day Robert Thompson had driven it home from the dealer. It was more than a machine, it was a testament to the enduring value of quality, maintenance, and the kind of patient wisdom that builds wealth one season at a time. The old Deere and the Ford had taught Michael that inheritance isn't just about what you receive, it's about what you understand. His father's greatest gift hadn't been hidden in a bank account or buried in mineral rights. It had been demonstrated every day in the way he lived, worked, and prepared his son for a future built on solid ground rather than shifting debt. In a world that often confuses activity with progress and spending with success, Robert Thompson had shown that sometimes the most valuable inheritance is the wisdom to recognize what you already have. The old equipment wasn't a burden to be endured or a limitation to be overcome. It was a foundation upon which to build a life of genuine prosperity, one paid for acre at a time. Like, share, and subscribe to the channel, activating notifications to be notified when new videos are published. God bless you.